In section 6.15, we start our discussion of the structural and functional organization of the nervous system. So on the screen, we see on the left-hand side of our diagram the central nervous system, which, as we know, consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And then on the right-hand side, we see a schematic overview of the peripheral nervous system. And so the peripheral nervous system here is divided into afferent and efferent divisions. The afferent divisions, carrying information into the central nervous system, are further subdivided into somatic, in other words, associated with the muscles, visceral, associated with internal organs, and sensory, special sensory. And so these are, for instance, eyes, ears, and many other specialized sensory organs that we'll talk about in Chapter 7 of our class. Next, we have the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. And so the efferent, or outgoing division, consists, of course, of the somatic motor division, in other words, the division that sends neurons to muscles, and the autonomic division. And so the autonomic division is further divided into the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric divisions of the nervous system. The sympathetic division, briefly, is that portion of the autonomic nervous system that prepares us for a fight or flight response. The parasympathetic promotes this rest and digest response, in other words, a relaxation, rebuilding kind of response. And then the enteric is associated with the digestive system. Now, it should be noted that the autonomic, if we need to review that, is oftentimes thought of as the automatic, or the division of the motor system that we do not have conscious control over. Somatic, which is headed to the muscles, obviously we do have conscious control over. We'll begin this chapter with a brief overview of the anatomy of the nervous system, beginning with the central nervous system. So here we spend a moment talking about the anatomy of the brain, and so we remind ourselves that the brain is divided into these four sections. The cerebrum, which of course makes up much of the mass of the brain, and we can see in our diagram divided into these four lobes that are named for overlying portions of the skull that cover these parts of the brain. Next, the diencephalon. The diencephalon, which is shown here in the region that I'm pointing to on the screen, consists of the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus, regions we'll talk about briefly on the next slide. Next, we have the brainstem. The brainstem consists of the midbrain, shown here, the pons, shown here, and the medulla oblongata, the portion of the brain through which all incoming and outgoing signals must pass. And then lastly, the cerebellum, shown here in the posterior region of the brain. This is a region of the brain heavily involved in processing, as we'll see in just a moment. As we look at the cerebrum, what we see is that it is divided into a thin outer region, about 3 millimeters thick, that's known as gray matter. The gray matter consists primarily of cell bodies, and that's why it appears gray, as opposed to the underlying region, which is referred to as white matter, because it contains a large number of myelinated fiber tracts. In other words, parallel running axons that are coated with myelin, as we've talked about previously. These two halves of the cerebrum are divided almost entirely, but they're connected they're almost entirely divided right down the center by this long, deep fissure, but they're connected via a number of fiber tracts that are collectively known as the corpus callosum. If we look here, as I point at the screen, we can see the tracts of the corpus callosum connecting the left and right halves of our cerebrum. Now, we mentioned previously the lobes that are present within our cerebrum. We see these lobes here, the frontal lobe shown here, parietal lobe shown here, the parietal lobe actually shown throughout the region I'm circling here, the occipital lobe shown here, and then the temporal lobe shown on either side of our brain. These regions of the cerebrum, of course, are named, as we mentioned, for the overlying regions of the skull bones. And we also notice this. We see a number of foldings that are present within the brain. And so perhaps we should go back to this slide to take a look at that. So what we see is that the ridges are referred to as gyri, or gyrus, singular, and the little valleys are referred to as sulci, or sulcus, singular. And collectively, these are present to increase the surface area of the cerebral cortex. What we see is that if these gyri and sulci were not present, then we would have significantly less volume of the cerebral cortex. In fact, our best estimates are that this increases the volume of cerebral cortex that we possess by about fourfold without any increase in the overall volume of the brain. So that's the reason for its existence. If we look at the cerebral cortex itself, then we find here that the essence of perhaps not what makes us human, but what separates us from a number of animals in terms of our intellectual abilities. And we see a number of different layers of cells. In fact, in humans, we have 6 layers of cells that are found in this 3 millimeter thick cerebral cortex. We have both pyramidal cells, which are shown here if we look at our diagram, which are primarily output cells, cells that are originating action potentials. And we have non-pyramidal cells, which are shown, for instance, right here, although I suppose they're not labeled, but the cells that have this appearance, such as here and here and here and here. And these non-pyramidal cells are primarily for receiving impulses that are action potentials that are arriving from the sensory nervous system, and for processing, as are, of course, as we understand, many of the interneurons that are found within our central nervous system. In fact, what we see is this, that the cerebrum is a very complex processing center. There's a tremendous amount of information received, and all those rules we talked about regarding the processing that's done by neurons come into play in this particular region of the brain. This is really what allows us our body to function, and especially what allows us to make decisions and respond to stimuli. Lastly, our book mentions something that I think is very interesting regarding the layers that are found within the cerebral cortex. And so we see this little picture of these different vertebrates located at the upper right-hand side of our screen. And your book mentions that there's a parallel increase in 2 things. In the number of layers that we have in the cerebral cortex, in other words, humans have 6, for instance, and in the processing complexity that that the organism is capable of. So, for instance, what we see is that reptiles have 3 cell layers found in their cerebral cortex, and dolphins have 5. And so it's a good example provided by our text. If we think about the responses of those animals, I think we'd all agree that reptiles are more of instinctual responders, whereas when we get into some of what we would consider perhaps egotistically higher mammals, then we see a little bit more complexity evident in the decision-making process. The diencephalon consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. These are regions of the brain that are not so much concerned with what we as humans might consider thinking, but they're concerned with tasks that are related to survival of the individual and, for instance, survival of the species through reproduction. So let's take a look at these briefly. We have the thalamus first. And so as we look at the thalamus, we see that it is located here, as I point with the pointer, and here, paired structures on the right and left hand sides of the brain, which consist of several large nuclei. Nuclei, as we recall, are clusters of cell bodies that are found within the central nervous system. And these nuclei are involved, among other things, in tasks such as alertness and allowing us to focus. A good bit of filtering occurs here. So, for instance, we have the capacity to stand in, as your book gives this example, of stand in a crowded room at a party and have a conversation, although it can be difficult, with one individual, and we're filtering out hundreds of other noises at that particular time and focusing on the one particular voice emanating from the person that we're conversing with, and the thalamus plays a big role in allowing us to filter out this information. The hypothalamus is certainly an interesting part of our brain. The hypothalamus, which is shown here in our diagram, again on the right and left-hand sides of the brain, on either side of the third ventricle, as was the thalamus, is the master center for neural and endocrine integration. So in other words, the hypothalamus is the master endocrine center of the human body. It's in control of the endocrine system, and the endocrine system essentially determines many, I don't want to say everything, but it determines a tremendous number of things that occur in the human body. It determines if you're going to be 8'10", like Robert Wadlow was, or whether you're going to be, barely 4 feet tall. Both of which would be the result of disorders associated with the hypothalamus. It determines when you go through puberty. It determines the release of all these hormones that are so important to the function of the body. When we get to the endocrine system chapter, we'll see that even slight variations in hormones like thyroid hormone or cortisol just have devastating impacts on human physiology. So it's safe to say that the hypothalamus is an essential control center of the human body, but a control center in the sense that it's controlling the endocrine system. And so these are slow, relatively, over days or weeks or perhaps months, changes, as opposed to other areas of the brain that we've talked about that exert very rapid control within seconds. We also definitely want to mention this, that originally humans thought that the pituitary gland was the master control center of the endocrine system. Endocrine, of course, meaning hormones. And we found out that that's actually not the case, but rather the pituitary, as we will review, serves, of course, at the pleasure of the hypothalamus, both in the case of the anterior and posterior pituitary. But it is interesting to note the importance of the pituitary. So the pituitary, of course, is shown right here in our diagram, a non-paired organ connected via the infundibulum to the hypothalamus, and sitting right there in the sella tertia of the skull, so a gland about the size of a pea that controls all these endocrine functions in the body. Lastly, at least for the diencephalon, we have the epithalamus. And so the epithalamus, although it's not pictured in our diagram here, fascinatingly contains the pineal gland. The pineal gland, as you know, releases melatonin in the absence of light and helps coordinate our sleep and wake cycle with a 24-hour cycle that will exist even in the absence of any change in the daylight cycle. And so the role of the pineal gland is to coordinate the so-called circadian rhythm and match it with the available light. Interestingly, what we see is that there are some ties between the pineal gland and reproduction, at least in other vertebrates. And so you may wonder, why do deer, for instance, breed in the fall and have fawns in the spring? Well, of course, they breed at that time as a result of the melatonin levels that they reach at that particular time of year. It's also worthwhile noting that in the case of humans, increased levels of melatonin have been associated with, in some cases, delayed onset of puberty. And so it's an interesting thing to note. It's certainly possible for a human to take melatonin. It's not FDA approved, but you can easily obtain it and to recover, for instance, from what we refer to as jet lag. And that's probably perfectly safe, especially for adults, but there's some questions that might surround that, some scientists believe. All right, guys, so lastly, here we have the limbic system. And so the limbic system, which is pictured on the lower right-hand side of our diagram there, or our slide there, consists of parts of two of the anatomical regions of the brain that we have just talked about. And so parts of the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, I was thinking two in terms of the cerebrum in the diencephalon. So parts of the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, thalamus, and hypothalamus are part of what we know as the limbic system. And so the limbic system is a region of the brain that has these interconnected fiber tracts and is associated with things as diverse as emotions. There's certainly a tie between hormones and emotions, and this tie is thought to be found here in the limbic system as a result of the tying in of two parts of our brain, the thalamus, which is, of course, the hormone control center of the body, as we mentioned, and then those cerebral lobes of our brain, which are largely involved in emotional responses. So the limbic system is involved in things like emotion, learning, behavior, and it ties in multiple regions of our brain. Next, we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum is shown here in our diagram, and the cerebellum is, again, not a region of the brain that we would think of as having anything to do with thinking, as we as human beings would think of the thought process. but rather it's a processing center, and it's primarily a processing center for somatic purposes. So what we see is that the ingoing and outgoing signals that are coming from our nervous system and going to our nervous system, and by incoming, I mean we have many receptors, like the Golgi tendon organ, for instance, that we'll talk about, and they tell us the position of our muscles. Even if our eyes are closed and we have no ability to see it, we can tell if a muscle is contracted or relaxed. So we have incoming and outgoing information here, and it goes primarily, most of it goes through the cerebellum and is processed, and the cerebellum allows our movements to be smooth and coordinated as opposed to short and jerky. It is possible, as has recently become the widely held belief, that some forms of learning may occur in the cerebellum, particularly areas of learning that are associated, for instance, with muscle movement. The brainstem consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and within it is found this one region of the brain that's absolutely essential for life, known as the reticular formation. The reticular formation consists of clusters of neurons that are found within the brainstem that send axons to almost all regions of the brain and release bioagenic amine neurotransmitters that are involved in allowing us to focus attention and stimulating alertness and wakefulness. And what we see is this, that I'm skipping bullet points here on the screen, but towards the bottom we see this idea of brainstem nuclei. And so, interestingly, this is the part of the reticular formation that's absolutely essential for life. These clusters of nuclei within the reticular formation that we're referring to here as brainstem nuclei form these centers that we refer to as the cardiovascular center, the respiratory center, the swallowing center, the vomiting center. And these centers are involved in those processes. And so because, of course, for instance, in the case of breathing, it's absolutely essential for life to occur. The cardiovascular system is a little bit different. But if that portion of the brain is destroyed, breathing ceases and life ceases along with that. What we notice also is this, that a number of the cranial nerves, in fact 10 of our 12 cranial nerves, exit here in this region of the brainstem. And so these are nerves that go out and innervate, for instance, muscle that are found in the face and other regions, sensory regions, for instance, that are located in the region of the head. And some of them even go down to the thoracic cavity and other parts of the body and reach destinations in those regions. As we look at the spinal cord, we see that we have two primary divisions of the spinal cord. We have the inner gray matter and the outer white matter. The inner gray matter, pictured here, gives us the dorsal horns that we see here. Think dorsal fin of the shark. These are oriented towards the back of the body. And the ventral horns that we see here, oriented towards the front of the body. So just like in the case of the brain, this is gray matter because it consists of non-myelinated structures, things like interneurons, cell bodies, dendrites of efferent neurons, axons of afferent neurons, and even glial cells. Now, surrounding the gray matter, we have white matter. And so the white matter, of course, is white because it's myelinated. And here we primarily have long axons that are taking information very rapidly, either towards the brain or away from the brain. And then that information is making its way through these dorsal and ventral horns of the gray matter before it's making its way out to, I'm assuming we're coming from the brain in this example, but before it's making its way out the spinal nerves to the actual effectors of the body. Now, if we look at the composition of spinal nerves, we see something interesting as well. So spinal nerves arise at regular intervals from the spinal cord. 31 spinal nerves, pairs of spinal nerves total arise. And what we notice is this, that we have both dorsal roots and ventral roots. The dorsal roots are taking information in the afferent direction towards the central nervous system, and the ventral roots are taking information away from the central nervous system in the efferent direction. So these two roots merge a very short distance from the spinal cord to form these things that we know as spinal nerves. And so it is these 31 spinal nerves and the 12 cranial nerves that make up the only connection we have between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system.